Hello and welcome to the section on functions. Let's look at the section objective and what you will learn after this section. Well, in this section you will learn how to define and call a function. Then you learn how to pass input parameters to a function and how to return a value from that function and how do you capture those return values. Then you'll understand what are default and optional parameters for a function. Then you'll understand how dynamic function actually works and you'll create your own dynamic function and you call it. Then you'll write anonymous function and also use some of the built-in functions. Then you'll be able to understand how to pass argument as a reference and you'll understand how the reference parameters works. And finally, we'll work with exercises, interview question, resources and assignments using functions, which will help you to understand the function concept much better. Okay, so let's understand each of these topics in details. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define and call a function. If you open up the materials folder, functions, example 1, define and call a function. Let's look at the logical flow of examples. So we'll understand how to define and call a function. If you open up the developable file, this is the file name we'll use. Copy this and we'll work with the example now. Saving the file, so I'll use www folder and I'll create a new folder here and I'll call it as functions. Okay, and I'll store my file under the folder called functions. Let's understand how to define and call a function. Let me show you how to define a function. Okay, this is the structure of a function. So function, actually you have to start with a keyword called function and then you have to give a function name. This name could be any name, it is a custom name. Then you have to open the parenthesis, close parenthesis, and then you have to pass the parameters and each parameter is separated with comma. And then you have to open the curly braces and close the curly braces and you have to put all the statements inside, whatever statements or expressions you can write inside the function. Then using a keyword called return, you return the value from the function. Okay, that's a basic syntax of how to write a function in PHP. Okay, so let's define a function. So we'll write a function to print an even numbers. The first thing is the function keyword. Okay, using this keyword you are saying I'm going to write a function. Okay, the first thing you do is after function keyword you write the function name. So print even numbers. Then you can pass the parameters. So I'll say some limit and with that limit I'm gonna print all the even numbers within this limit number. Okay, now I'll write a for loop inside for index is equal to 0, index is less than equal to this limit, whatever limit I'm gonna pass. Then I'm going to say index plus plus. Now I have the running integers and I can actually check now. And this is going to be an even number. Okay, now I have the function written, which is called as print even numbers. Okay, it has an input parameter and then I'm not returning anything from this function. Okay, I'm just printing some even numbers from this function. How to call this function? Copy the name of the function. Okay, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, and basically you have to pass the limit. The limit could be 20. Okay, so till 20 we're going to print all the even numbers. So let's run this. So I'm gonna go in the folder called functions. So now the function has been called and function is able to print all the even numbers till the limit that you have mentioned. Okay, so the logic is pretty simple. Is a for loop which is checking if it's an even and odd number. If it's even, it's printing this even numbers. So that's basically how to define a function. How do you define a function? You use a keyword called function, your custom name, then the input parameters, Okay, and then how to call a function. You have to pass in the function name and you have to pass the parameters if it has any. This is calling the function. Okay, and I want to show you what happens if you pass in a string. Okay, here you haven't mentioned any data type, but you're passing a string. So let's see what happens now. So it's able to print even though you're passing a string. The reason behind you haven't mentioned what type of parameter is this. Once this parameter goes in for loop, it actually becomes an integer, and the for loop is able to convert that string into an integer and then use it for the looping purpose. Okay, so anyway, don't practice this method. Okay, if you know this has to be integer, always pass integers. Okay, so let's write a simple method, that is add method. We'll say add and we'll say a comma b. Okay, two parameters that we are passing and we just want to return something, so you can say return a plus return b. So you're using a keyword called return, and then we are adding a plus b, and then what is the value of a plus b is being returned from that function. So you can use echo and say add 10 comma 20. So this add method you're calling with two parameters a and b, that is 10 and 20. So 10, the first value will go to first variable, the second value go to second variable, and when you issue and return command, whatever value has been returned is been printed over here. Okay, so let's look at that example. Okay, so 30 is printed. The 30 is coming up from this return statement, and that 30 has been printed with the echo statement. Okay, so that's how you work with functions. You have understood how to define a function, how to call the function with some parameters, and also how to return a value from a function. Okay, so that's all on this lecture on how to define and call a function, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on passing input parameters to functions. So you'll understand how to pass input parameters. So if you open up the functions folder example 2, the logical flow is basically to learn how to pass parameters to function and even validate them. So part of this, I will create this PHP file. So let's do this example. So for this, we have to even validate the input parameters. So for that, we will say declare strict types is equal to 1. Okay, you're gonna see why I am doing this. One way of defining declare strict types is equal to 1 is if some parameter saying okay pass integers, then if you're passing string, then it will fail. Okay, it's gonna validate all the data types and it won't do automatic conversions. It's gonna stop you doing automatic conversions. Okay, so for this we are telling to interpreter that please check all those mismatch variable types. Okay, so let's define a function this time. This time we'll say print odd numbers. It's not much about how to define even and odd numbers, but try to focus on how to define a function, how to pass parameters, and try to understand the concept. We will pass two parameters. One, we will mention it as int. All right, this time we will specify it has to be integers, and we will say okay, I want to skip some numbers. Okay, which means if you have this number, please skip it. Okay, so we're gonna write the same loop. So if $index is equal to $skip number, then we're gonna continue. We're gonna skip the checking of that number. So index modulus 2 not equal to 0, that will denote as an odd number, and we're gonna print out the odd number. Okay, so let's call this method. Okay, so if you pass 20 comma 3, let's say we are passing one integer and one string. Because we have said we want strict types, so before that we are not going to check the data type, so we're going to say index with skip number. We are not checking with integer to string, so we'll just check between the value of that variables. Okay, so let's run that. The number 3 has been skipped, but there is no problem in printing the odd numbers. Okay, because this is an integer and we have set it as an int, so it's perfectly matched. For this we haven't told what is the data type, so it's perfectly okay for PHP. If you do the same thing and if you call this with 20, then you will have an error. Okay, the error is coming up because you have said declare strict types, and that's why it's unable to accept as a string when you say as an integer. Okay, and what happens when you do this? Okay, so let's try out that. So even that is an error because you said you have 2 parameters, but you have passed only 1 parameter. That's also a strict type. Okay, so understand how the strict types work. That is the first thing we have learned here, how to declare strict types. So you understand when you don't want to do an automatic conversion and you want to put some strict rules on your program, then you declare it as strict types as 1. Then PHP will stop you to do automatic conversions and expect you to pass some correct values to your methods. So one thing we learned here, how to pass a parameters. You can specify the data type or you can skip those data type, but if you don't have the declare strict types, then you can pass strings or you can pass numbers. It's just going to accept when you don't mention any data type. Okay, so I hope it's a very simple example how to pass an input parameter to a function. Just define the input parameters and just pass over. And when you have a strict types and when you didn't pass all the input parameters, that will create an error. Well, I hope that's a very simple example on how to pass parameters to a function, and that's all on this lecture on passing input parameters, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on return value from functions. Let's understand how to return a value from a function. So open up the logical flow. So we'll learn how to return a value from functions. Part of it will create this file. So let's create this file. So let's first understand what is the structure that you have to follow when you want to return something. So you can say function, and then you can say function name, then you have params inside it, then you can specify a semicolon here, and you can say return type. Okay, what you're returning, and when you want to return something, you can use the return keyword to return something, right? So we're going to look into this example. So let's say we have a method called add $a comma $b. Now you can specify after a colon what you're returning. So what type you're returning. So I'm saying I'm returning an integer type. So because I'm gonna say a plus b, so it will be an integer type, and I'm gonna pass that as an integer. Okay, so when you want to do this, you can even say addition, and you can take off that operation back to a variable, and then you can return that variable. Okay, and how to call this? So we'll say echo result 1 comma 2. Okay, so let's execute this. So the result is 3. Okay, so we are successfully able to call a method and we are able to return the value, and we have mentioned what is the data type of the value that has been returned. So let's write a function and then we'll return an array. Okay, so we'll say get even numbers, and we'll say limit. Now we'll say we are returning an array. And we'll define an array. That's how you define an empty array. So this is how we are adding a value to an array, and then we will return the return array. Okay, now we can say even numbers, and then we can say get even numbers, and you can pass the 10, some value to it. That's the limit. And then you can do a var dump or a print r of that variable, and you should be able to see a array. Okay, now you're able to see an array of all the even numbers that has been captured. Okay, so that's how you work with returning a value from a function. Remember, when you want to specify what data type you are passing from a return value, you have to mention it after the colon. You have to mention what data type you are printing, but it's not mandatory, right? You can even run this. It doesn't really complain on whether you are specifying or not. It's actually a good practice to explain about this function. Okay, if someone see this, they say, okay, this is a function, it is accept a parameter, it returns an array. You don't have to read the code. Without even reading a code, you actually just looking at this line, you know the function is going to return an array. Okay, so that's the beauty of having and specifying the return type. It is actually a good programming practice that you mention what is the return type. Well, that's all about returning values from functions, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on default and optional values, that is the input parameter values. How to define a default parameter and an optional parameter for a function. Okay, we're going to look into that example now. So if you open up the logical flow, so we'll assign a default and optional parameters to a function. So let's do this example in this file. So first thing we're going to say declare strict types. Is equal to 1. So I'm going to copy over two functions. One is odd numbers and one is even numbers. So I've copied over print odd numbers and print even numbers, so I don't have to type all this logic, which is not required part of this understanding. The most important thing that we are understanding here is how to pass a parameter, a default parameter and an optional parameter. Okay, the first thing is you are saying int limit. Okay, and then you are saying skip number. Okay, this we have seen previously. And if you want to pass an optional value, optional means if this is not specified, then you say this value is -1. Right, -1 means if you want to skip, it's never going to be -1, so it's never going to be skipped anything. But if you're going to pass any integer, then this value is skipped. Okay, that's basically an optional value. If you don't mention anything, the -1 is the default value assigned to the skip numbers. However, it is optional because it is the last parameter. If you're gonna reverse the parameter, like skip number is -1, limit. Now this is not an optional parameter, nor this is an optional parameter. The optional parameters should be at the last. The optional parameters cannot be in the starting. Remember this concept very well, because this understanding will help you to write default and optional parameters. When you use is equal to and specify some value, it becomes a default value. When you don't mention anything, this value will be assigned to that function. It's fine. When you want to have an optional parameters, optional means when you don't specify that value. When you don't specify that value, that variable has to be on the last. It cannot be on the starting. Okay, let's do an example of this. So we do print odd numbers. So if you notice odd numbers, I'm going to pass only 10 and I'm going to skip the skip numbers. Okay, because that is an optional parameter and the default value is -1. So let's print this, and I'm saying strict type. So if anything is missed, if I'm doing anything wrong, PHP is going to catch me, right? Okay, it haven't skipped anything 1 3 5 7 9, and it has able to run the function without me passing the skip numbers. So by default it took -1, and definitely it's a positive integer, so nothing has been skipped. So let's call the print even numbers, and print even numbers have 2 input parameters, and we understand the optional parameter when you specify equal to has to be on the last, because there is no such parameters on the last. If you specify just one value, okay, first of all, this value, will it go here or here? We are not sure, right? Because the 10 can go to skip number. You have to mention the limit as well. If you don't mention it, then it's gonna return an error, right? Well, the default has to be on the last, not onto the first. So if you want to have a default option here, you have to change the way you are calling the input parameters. You should do something like this, then your method will work. Okay, so remember, when you want to have a default and optional, you have to specify on the right hand side, not on the left hand side. So keep all your default and optional onto the last, and you should able to just loop it over. Means you can add a is equal to 1, and you can say b is equal to 2, and it's perfectly fine. You just don't add any of those variables. Okay, you can just have n number of variables, and you can have all the default values, and they are all optional, because if you don't even mention it, it's perfectly fine. Okay, so understand the rule for default and optional parameter, and understand how they should be sequenced in your input parameter, and when you call them, where it should be in the sequence of the input parameter. Okay, so that's all about default parameters and optional parameters, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on dynamic function calling. So let's understand how to call your function dynamically. It's a very simple, very easy concept. Let's do a simple example and understand this concept. So if you open the logical flow, we're calling a function from a variable value. That's basically a concept called as dynamic function calling. I'm going to look into that example now. Let's say we have a function, add function, and we are returning an integer. Very simple, right? Not much on what is a function and what it does. The most important thing is, let's say you have a variable, right? You have defined a variable called add function, and you have passed a value called add. Right now, when you print this variable, okay, it has something called as a value which is add. Okay, let's do add functions. Okay, let's run this first, and I'll explain you what is dynamic function calling. Okay, you just print the value add, right? It's just a string, right? So this variable actually also hold add as a value, which is nothing but a function name. Because it holds the same function name, you can add a parenthesis to it, and you can actually pass parameters to it as well. So it actually behaves as an add method because it has the reference to that function name. So we'll see what happens whether it's able to call that method or not. Okay, you see the value 1 plus 2 is 3. So this is called as dynamic function calling, and the beauty of this is you can change the value of it. You can change it to subtract and runtime, and the method here will do subtract now, right? The same method, same code, nothing has been changed. You have just changed the reference of your method. Okay, and then that is coming up from a variable. So variable actually dynamically holding the function name, and you are just calling whatever the value of this variable. We are calling the method name on what has been stored in this variable. Okay, very simple and easy concept to understand, but don't get confused how the add function is able to call add function, because it has add name and we are passing the parenthesis to it. So it's basically take whatever value in this variable and put it over here. So it's basically doing this, right? It's replacing that variable with the value and then doing the next operation, which is calling the method. Okay, and if you have like 1, obviously this will fail because there is no method called 1, but if you have like method 1, then this will pass. Okay, so understand is just a reference, dynamic reference of a function inside a variable, and once you pass the parenthesis, then it basically able to call that function. Okay, so very simple concept, and that's all the lecture on dynamic function calling, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on anonymous function. As the name suggests, anonymous functions are functions which doesn't have a function name. So we're going to define it, and we're going to understand how to define a function without a function name. So part of this, we will create an anonymous function and we'll call it, and we'll understand how to create an anonymous function. So let's create this file. So what are anonymous functions? Which does not have a function name. It's very simple to understand, and they are also called as closures. Okay, they are closures because they don't have any name to it. So let's copy over one of the function that we have written previously. Okay, so we have seen this dynamic function calling by passing the function name to a variable and calling that function. Okay, we'll convert this into an anonymous function without a variable name. Okay, so we'll say add function. We're converting this function, dynamic function calling, into an anonymous function. So we can directly say function. Okay, anonymous function are functions which doesn't have a name, so I'm not gonna give any name to it. And obviously you can follow all the syntax of a function. You don't have to worry about what happens after you start defining a function. You can just normally start writing the function. Okay, and I'm going to pass that as a parameter as well, and then you can do a return of addition. Then we're going to pass $a, $b, right? This is basically defining the function without a function name, and you're assigning to a variable. So variable actually holds a function, and how to call, just say echo, and you call it as normally as you're calling any function. No, not much difference on how do you call, but these are called as anonymous function, wherein you don't want to define functions like simple functions like add and all those things. You just want to store it in a variable, and using that variable you just want to access that function. So don't forget to close the semicolon here, and then we're going to run this. Okay, so it's very simple. You define a function without a name and assign it to a variable, and using the parenthesis you're trying to call the add function. So let's see if you have a variable, and are you able to access that variable inside a function. So let's say you have a variable called content, and this is a string message. So let's define a function to access this variable inside a closure. Okay, so I'm gonna say print content. I'm gonna say function, nothing fancy here, and okay, function, and I'm gonna echo the content. Okay, don't forget to close. Now we'll call the function. Okay, so let's do PHP. So we are not able to access that content, okay, even though it's outside, and we are not able to call from the function. This is basically a very valid questions when you do interviews or when you're writing a written test. Someone will ask you to say, how do you access content inside a closure? Okay, for that you have to say use and mention that variable. Once you do that, then you're able to access that string. Okay, so don't forget, when you have a function, you want to use variables inside it. You're not passing the variable as an argument. Remember that you're using a variable that is outside the function. Then you have to use that variable name, and that variable name can be accessed inside this function. Okay, so that's basically how do you define an anonymous function and how do you access a variable inside a closure. Okay, so that's all the example on how to work with anonymous function, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on inbuilt functions. So in this example, we'll understand how to read and function from a PHP manual. Okay, so open up the example 7 inbuilt functions, open up the logical flow and example. So we'll understand how to read functions from the PHP function library. So open up the deliverable file, then you'll find this URL, that's from the manual. Let's open up this URL and understand how to read a function from the PHP manual. Okay, this is basically prototype. This is very helpful concept to understand when you want to find a method in PHP manual. You need to understand how to read a function. Okay, so there are a couple of things that you need to understand how to read a function. First is the description of the function. Okay, whenever there's a function, something like this, there is a function name, the input parameter data type, the input parameter name, colon, the return type. Okay, so if you can read this line, okay, then most of the functions in PHP manual you will try to understand what is the function name, what is the input parameter, what is the return type. Okay, so understand how to read a function. So how to read a function, this is how the prototype looks like. There's a function name, parameter type, parameter name, and the return type. Okay, this is how it has been defined: function name, data type, parameter name, and the return type. Okay, there will be another functions something like this. Let's understand how to read this function. In array is basically the name of the function. Okay, this is basically a prototype. In array is the name of the function, and mixed $needle. So what is mixed? Mixed basically it could be any data type. $needle is basically the name of the parameter. Array is the data type. $haystack is the name of the variable. And there's something called as square brackets, which means it is optional parameter and it is of type boolean, and it's a variable is strict, and if you don't pass a value, the value is false. Okay, and its return type basically colon boolean, so this will return a type of boolean. Okay, and it's very important you should understand this prototype, because if you want to read a function from PHP library or manual, you need to understand how the prototype looks like, right? I'll just repeat quickly. This is the name of the function. Mixed means any data type, and this is the variable name. It's an array data type and it's a variable name. Square brackets means optional boolean data type of the variable strict, and default value is false. Okay, so that's how you basically read a function. So let's read a function. Let's read string length. So let's open up string length, and this is how basically when you want to understand how to read a string length, you will go to string length manual. Then you will see, okay, this is the name of the function which is used to get the string length. And how to read this? This is the name of the function, this is the input parameter, and this is the output parameter, and this one will return the length of the string, right? And the input parameter is of type string and the variable is string, and the output is an integer. Okay, and then you can find all the description of how to use this function. Okay, so the most important thing is the description portion. Well, you should understand how to read a function from the PHP manual. Well, that's this lecture to help you understand how to read a method from PHP manual, and you can go ahead and take any of the examples from PHP manual and try to understand the description portion. And most of the time, if you are understanding how to read a function from the description, then you have understood the functions concept properly. Okay, there are many concepts in function. One of the most common thing is optional parameter and default parameters and the return types. You need to understand where is the return type and what are the optional parameters, which is denoted with the square brackets, and rest of the things are very simple and straightforward to understand. Okay, so that's all on this lecture on inbuilt functions, how to read a function from PHP manual, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on passing argument as reference. So let's open up the logical flow of examples. We'll learn how to pass a variable reference to the function parameter. So when I say reference, reference actually means the physical address of a variable in the memory. Okay, we're going to see that example. So part of this will create this file. Let's do an example without passing value as a reference. Then we'll try to convert it into as a reference. Okay, so let's do a function which is add, which has a call $b. We'll return a type. Typically, if you are writing a function and you want to return something, you store it in a variable and then you return that variable. Okay, that is a good practice, right? And if you want to store this function output, you are using a result variable, right? So we are saying echo, let's print the result first. Okay, then we are saying $result is equal to and 1, 2. Very simple basic stuff here, and then we're going to print the result here. Okay, so quickly let's look into this. Okay, so earlier it was 0, then it is 3. So you are actually assigning the output of this function to this variable. Okay, let's do the similar thing and we'll convert the parameter as a reference. So instead of $result, we will put ampersand. So ampersand actually means I want to access this variable physical address. Okay, and I'm gonna say result is equal to a plus b, and I'm going to remove the return, and there is no return type for this. Okay, and I'm not gonna pass anything here, but I'm gonna pass result as a variable here. Okay, when you have ampersand here, it's not the variable value is being passed. Here we have seen the add method actually returns the value, but here when you are passing this variable physical address is being passed on to the result, not the value. It's a reference, means it is a physical address of this result to this result. So whenever you change any value at that address, the variable value will also be changed. So, okay, let's look at an example. Okay, so it's again 0 and 3. Okay, this time this add method is not storing a value into result. Here we have stored that value into a result, but instead we have passed the variable as a reference to it. So whenever this value is being changed to this variable, automatically it will reflect the variable value. Okay, This is passing as reference, and the symbol that we use is ampersand. Anywhere you mention ampersand means you're passing that variable as a reference. Okay, and whenever you change this value gets affected globally. Okay, so understand this concept. This is a very important concept in passing a variable as a reference. Sometimes you just want to pass something and you want to change it into that function. This is a good way of handling those things. Okay, so that's all about how to pass a variable by reference, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the exercise 1. The exercise is very simple. You have to create a function that accepts a parameter and return a value. This exercise will help you to practice how to write functions, how to pass parameters, and how to return values. Okay, so part of this, open the logical flow, write a simple function to accept parameters and return some value. Okay, it's a very simple example. You can try it out, and part of it you can create this file. Okay, pause this video here and do the exercise. Welcome back. So let's do this exercise. It's a very simple exercise where you have to create a function, pass some parameter and return a value. So I'll say get full name, and I'm going to pass two variables, that is the first name and the last name, and a return type is a string. Okay, and I'm gonna say full name is equal to first name and last name. Okay, and I'm gonna return full name. Okay, how to call this function? Echo okay, let's execute this. Okay, that's very simple. So we have done couple of things here. We have created a function with a function name, passed some parameters, and we have defined a return type, and we are able to call the function. Well, that's the exercise on functions, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on exercise 2. So exercise 2 is to create a calculate function. Okay, so let's see what are the logical flow. So you have to write a function to accept two integer values, and you have to show add, subtract, multiply and divide, accept optional parameters to perform specific operations. Then we have to print output from the function, and we have to declare strict types is equal to 1. Okay, so that's your exercise, and you have to write a function called calculate, and then you have to pass two integer values, and based on the operations that you specify into your functions, you have to get that output from the function. Okay, that's your exercise. You can go ahead and do that exercise now, and part of it you can save that exercise in this file. Okay, so pause this video here and do this exercise now. Welcome back. So let's create that function. So first we're going to declare strict types is equal to 1. Then we're going to create a function called calculator, and we're going to pass two values. I'm going to say operation is equal to, let me convert into lowercase, and I'm going to do a switch. The value is add, subtract, multiply and divide. And for default, we are going to do all the operations. Okay, so we're going to do divide, we're going to do addition, subtraction and multiplication. So for each of this item, we're going to say add result, subtract, then divide. Okay, and when you do the operation, I want to print all those add, subtract, multiply and divide. Okay, so that's our function. That's a function printing the calculator function. So let's call this function now. So we do calculator 1, 2. We want to perform all the operations. Now we'll specify the operation add, we can say multiply, and we can say multiply here, you can say divide here. Okay, so let's run this code. Okay, so we have addition, subtraction, multiplication, divide, and we have all these operations. Okay, so we have created a calculator function, and we have passed two variables, and we have also created some optional variable here, and then we based on the switch conditions, and then we have done the operation here. Okay, well, that's the exercise on creating a calculator function, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the practical test. So for the assignment, you can create a calculate discounted price function. Okay, so let's see what you can create in this example. So open up the logical flow. So here is the assignment that you have to do. Make a function and call that function as get discounted price. There are two input parameters, one is price and one is the discount percentage, and the return value is the discounted price. Okay, so this method will calculate the discounted price based on the price and the discount percentage, and the formula is given it here. You can use this formula to calculate the discounted price and return that value from this method. So this method is helpful when you want to calculate the discount percentage for a given price. Okay, so formula is here, and you know what is input parameter and you know what is the function name. So go ahead and do this exercise and create this method, and then you call this method with different values and try to figure out whether the calculation is perfectly done by your function or not. So all the best and do this exercise. So that's all for this lecture on assignment, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the summary section of functions. So by now you should be able to define and call a function. You You should be able to understand how to pass input parameters to a function and how to capture the return value. You should understand what are default and optional parameters of a function. You should understand how dynamic function calling works. Then you should understand how to write anonymous function and how to use built-in functions. Then you should be able to understand how to pass an argument as a reference. And I hope you have worked with exercises, interview question, resources, and also you have taken the assignments using functions. Well, that's the end on section on functions, and I hope you have pretty much understanding how to work with functions now. Okay, so that's all for this section on functions, and I'll see you in the next one.